So let me start with what BDS is about, the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions movement, and then we'll get to the environment and water issues later on. The Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions call was issued by the absolute majority of Palestinian civil society on July 9th, 2005. By the absolute majority, we mean all the main political parties, all the trade unions, all of them. The women's unions, the youth, teachers, writers, just about everyone. And not just Palestinians inside the occupied territories, but also Palestinians in Israel and Palestinians in exile. So the BDS call, for the first time in decades, addressed the basic rights under international law for the three main communities that constitute the Palestinian people: Palestinians in the occupied territories, Palestinian citizens of Israel, and Palestinians in exile. Why is that? Why couldn't we just focus on the occupation, which is more convenient, which is easier? Everyone understands the occupation. Not everyone understands the problem with Palestinian citizens of Israel. And some people understand the refugee issues, but not many. Because the Palestinian people is made up of those three segments. In fact, only 38% of the Palestinians are in the occupied territories, including East Jerusalem. Only 38%. West Bank, Gaza, including East Jerusalem. 12% are Palestinian citizens of Israel, and a whole 50% are in exile in the diaspora. Even among the 50% within historic Palestine, within the West Bank, Gaza, and the current state of Israel, a huge number, a huge minority are also refugees or internally displaced persons, IDPs. Together, the IDPs and refugees constitute 69% of the Palestinian people. 69%, more than two-thirds. That's why the issue of the right of return becomes the absolute most important right for the Palestinian people, because it addresses the absolute majority of the Palestinians, 69%, whereas ending the occupation alone addresses 38% of the Palestinian people. This is why the BDS call of 2005 addressed all three basic rights of the three main communities under international law: ending the occupation of 1967, including the colonies, the wall, and so on. Number two, ending the system of racial discrimination against Palestinian citizens of Israel, giving them full equality by law, and I'll get to that in a bit. And the third is the right of return for refugees in accordance with UN Resolution 194. So we're not asking for the moon. We're asking for our basic rights under international law, but our basic rights for the entire Palestinian people, not the redefined Palestinian people, those in the West Bank and Gaza only. These are not the Palestinian people. This is a tiny part of the Palestinian people, but it's convenient to forget that, especially in the West. So we want to remind people that no, our people are those three parts. From the beginning, the BDS call has been anchored in international law and human rights principles, so it rejects all forms of racism, including anti-Semitism. This is a very, very clear-cut issue in our principles, our opposition to all racism, and we make it very explicit to anti-Semitism. So we do not welcome anti-Semites within our ranks, and we do not work with anti-Semites. Also, the BDS call has a very explicit call to conscientious Israelis, Jewish Israelis, to join our struggle for freedom, justice, and equality for everyone. So from the beginning, we addressed the Israeli public, asking them to join our struggle, and we're very much inspired in that by the South African anti-apartheid movement, that it's a joint struggle for freedom, justice for everyone. It cannot be a totally separate struggle. And today, in fact, we have a very strong Israeli component in the BDS movement, the Coalition of Women for Peace. I don't know if you've met with them. No? It's an Israeli coalition of women groups that produces this excellent website called whoprofits.org, one word, whoprofits.org. Who Profits is an excellent, well-researched database of companies profiting from the occupation. Israeli, international, Croatian, South African, European, whatever the case may be. So you go to the whoprofits.org, you search for a specific company, and it tells you how exactly it's involved in the occupation specifically. It doesn't address other international law violations, just the occupation. So the Coalition of Women for Peace is a very important partner of ours. Also, Boycott from Within. Boycott from Within is an Israeli group that endorsed the BDS call in 2009 since the attack on Gaza, and is working with us as our allies in many BDS campaigns around the world, especially with the cultural boycott. You might have heard about the great progress we're making in cultural boycott specifically. Many artists canceling or boycotting. Roger Waters coming out and saying, I call on all rock and roll artists to boycott Israel, as we did South Africa, and so on and so forth. This tremendous push in the cultural boycott, the unseen component in that, it's not just Palestinian BDS campaign and our British partners, our South African partners, our American partners, Canadian, French, they're all working, but also our Israeli partners are at the core of this work. Our Israeli partners, whenever we address an artist not to perform in Israel, as they avoided Sun City in South Africa, we're asking them to avoid Tel Aviv, our Israeli partners always write letters to artists telling them, we don't want you to come and entertain Israeli apartheid. And they use the term apartheid, which is a very strong message coming from Jewish Israeli activists. And they're very diverse, intellectuals, academics, students, LGBT activists, and so on and so forth. So BDS has many forms. Economic, financial, academic, cultural, environmental, military, and sports, and so on. One thing that's not understood about BDS is the academic and cultural boycott. Many people misunderstand that specific part. I mean, everyone can understand the economic boycott, boycotting companies, products, and so on, divesting from companies, that's understood. But academic and cultural, that's not very understood. Many people think we're calling for a boycott of Israeli academics or Israeli artists. We're not. This is not like the South African boycott. The South African academic and cultural boycott was a boycott against everyone and everything South African. The Palestinian academic and cultural boycott is not. It addresses institutions only. It targets institutions only. So we target universities, we target orchestras, we target dance groups, we target institutions, groups, not individual artists. This is not because individual academics and artists are any better than the mainstream in Israeli society, which is extremely far right, very fanatic. They're just as bad. In fact, one can argue that they're even worse, because they should know better. Academics and writers and intellectuals they should know better. They're not selling vegetables in a market and they don't read them. They know what's happening exactly, but they still stick with the party line, with the mainstream line, supporting the absolute majority in oppressing the Palestinians. So we're not doing an individual boycott, not because individual academics and artists are better, but because we avoid at all cost any McCarthyist political testing. We do not, on principle, accept political testing. Who's a good Israeli, who's a bad Israeli? This is not something we do. So any McCarthyist type of testing, we avoid. Institutions, it's very easy. They either have a position against the occupation and Israeli violations of international law, or they don't. If they don't, we boycott them. It's easy. But individuals, we don't want to get into the moral issue of who's a good person, who's a bad person. We leave that to the United Nations, as happened in South Africa when they developed a blacklist. We don't get into that. So that's in a nutshell what we do. And I'll give some examples of the impact of BDS. Why, in the last couple of years specifically, it has grown tremendously and has become a very effective strategy of resistance and strategy of solidarity with the Palestinian people. In fact, the most effective form of solidarity with the Palestinian people today. Some successes, I'll start with the academic and cultural, although they're the best known, and then I'll end up with the economic. In the academic sphere, the University of Johannesburg in South Africa was the first to boycott an Israeli university. That was in 2011, after a long campaign supported by hundreds of prominent South African academics, including many Jewish academics, who called for severing links between Johannesburg and Ben Gurion University, an Israeli university involved in human rights violations. So that was a very important symbolic victory for the academic boycott. In the cultural boycott, you've heard about all the singers and musicians canceling and bans, and so I don't need to get into that. But perhaps the most significant successes in the last year or so in the academic and cultural boycott have been truly effective, truly consequential. The most important, perhaps, is Stephen Hawking, the great scientist, British scientist, boycotting an Israeli conference after being appealed to by Palestinian academics, as well as British academics, of course. But in his press statement, he said that it was the consensus among Palestinian academics who addressed me that convinced me to cancel my participation. And of course, our British partners, our Israeli partners, our American partners played a very important role in convincing Stephen Hawking. But it was the Palestinian consensus that actually did the trick. But it wasn't the only success we've had in the last 6 to 8 months. The Teachers Union of Ireland endorsed by consensus the academic boycott of Israel. The Federation of Francophone Students in Belgium, which has 100,000 members. These are just samples. I'm not telling you everything because it'll take too long. The Francophone Student Federation in Belgium, which has 100,000 members, adopted academic boycott. The Asian American Studies Association in the US, in the United States, adopted the academic boycott. Again, consensus. There was no dissent in the national conference, and this is an academic association in the United States, in the belly of the beast, which counts a lot. It's not British. Britain is easier, but this is American. So, because we have massive support in Britain, South Africa, India, Brazil, that's easier. But in the US, it's not easy. It's a very difficult battle. So we've had quite a few successes in the academic and cultural sphere. In the economic sphere, where it counts perhaps the most, people would say, yes, it's very effective culturally, but Israel is a very strong economy. Do you really think you can affect it through this non-violent, international law-abiding kind of movement? Yes, we are affecting it. It's not that we think we will affect it. We are affecting Israel economically, albeit in gradual steps. What are the indicators of that? Let's start with what Israelis say. In June of this year, Netanyahu decided to shift the overall responsibility of handling the BDS movement from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which handled it since it was conceived in 2005 till now, from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to the Ministry of Strategic Affairs.
What do you mean by handle? Sorry.
In Israel, they have many departments working against BDS around the world. The foreign ministry has taken the lead in being the overall responsible in the Israeli government for coordinating all efforts. So while the Ministry of, intelligence, the army, different parts are doing different things. And military intelligence, for example, is doing some work spying on activists in the West. Openly, they said that. So there are many departments within government in Israel that are working against BDS. The overall responsibility was, until June, under the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. There was a desk there responsible for countering BDS, which they called the delegitimization campaign. Since June, Netanyahu shifted that responsibility to the Ministry of Strategic Affairs. So now, countering BDS is handled by the Ministry of Strategic Affairs. This doesn't mean that Israel will stop its propaganda war against BDS. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs will continue its propaganda machinery, but it has not been very successful. They know that and we know that. They're not getting anywhere. They're spending hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars branding Israel. They call it the Brand Israel campaign. To no avail. Nothing is happening. On the ground, they're losing hearts and minds. On the ground, they're losing the grassroots. They have governments in their pockets, of course. European governments, the US government, especially because of the US government. The establishment is in their pockets, easy. Israel has tremendous power up there. But down there, it's losing it. Completely losing it. And this is a factor of two things. First, Israel's ultra-right policies. Israel is not what it used to be. I mean, it dropped the mask. It's openly, fanatically right, religious, fundamentalist, disgustingly settlement-oriented. I mean, it dropped the mask completely. All Israeli governments have been consistent in ethnic cleansing the Palestinians, and so left, right, and center. There is no left, right, and center when it comes to Israeli governments. All the same. Very, very little difference as far as we're concerned. But they all had a very good mask. People like Shimon Peres and Barak and Livni, they had a good mask. not Netanyahu's and Lieberman's and Bennett's and those kinds of people. The government today is completely dominated by settlers and settler movements. So settlers are not a majority in government, but settler movements have a control in government, a majority in government. This was the main factor that led to the loss of the hearts and minds around the world. Israel lost its liberal facade completely, totally. And the second is BDS. Now people have something to do. If you're angry at Israeli policies, do something about it. Don't just go out there, demonstrate and burn an Israeli flag. It's nice, but it doesn't do much. It's important to address companies in your context that are involved. Let's say I'm Irish, and there's a cement company. This is not this is a real example. A cement company, the largest cement company in Ireland, is very involved in Israeli violations of international law. In fact, it's providing cement to the wall. So instead of going out and demonstrating for Palestinian rights only, I can do something about it. I can pressure my cement company to withdraw from its violations of international law. So now people can do something in their locale, in their context, that's effective. That's what BDS provides. It provides an ethically, morally consistent, effective tool in the local context to do something about injustice in Palestine. And to do something about your own government and institutions and companies' involvement. It's not just, I hate Israel, I hate the Israeli occupation. Well, do something about it. How about your Irish companies and British companies and American and Canadian and South African? They're all involved in maintaining that injustice. Do something about it from your context. Don't just come and help us with the olive harvest. It's nice, but it's not enough. Really, it's not enough.
This is what we need to hear. So.
Yes, I mean, really, we appreciate the charity, but we need solidarity. Really. We cannot work with charity alone. We absolutely need solidarity. Martin Luther King Jr. said something very, very important. And of course, we're not just inspired by the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, we're also inspired by the civil rights movement in the US. So Martin Luther King defined boycott in very simple terms. He said at the very basic level, it's withdrawing support for an evil system or policy. So it's not heroic. It's not something actively you're going to the garrisons, as it were, and fighting with the people that oppress. No, at the very least, withdraw your support an evil system. You'll help the oppressed a lot by doing that. If all people withdraw their support for this evil system, the occupation and apartheid here, we'll be fine. We'll be fine. But the system, the oppressive system, continues because of complicity of thousands and thousands of companies and institutions around the world. So that gives people a local thing to do. Some examples of the success, but before that, I said in passing that BDS is already recognized by Israel as a strategic issue. It's a strategic threat, they call it. It's handled by the Strategic Affairs Ministry. But what indicator do I have other than that objective indicator that BDS is in fact having an impact on the Israeli regime of occupation, colonization, and apartheid? The most important recent indicator is in March of this year, the BBC GlobeScan poll. We take all polls with a grain of salt, but the BBC GlobeScan is among the better ones because it's conducted in many countries around the world, and it ranks countries according to what's the best perceived and what's the worst perceived country in the world. Israel, for the last number of years, the last 3 years at least, has been competing with North Korea over the third or fourth worst perceived country in the world. That's where Israel belongs in the public opinion of 26 or 28 countries, including the largest nations in Europe. The largest countries around the world, in fact. And lest you would think that this is only in Egypt and South Africa and India, in Britain it's 70%, I think, who view Israel negatively. In Germany, I think it was 66% viewing Israel negatively. In France, Spain, Italy, the biggest nations in Europe, 66, 67, 68%. So 2/3 majorities in Europe view Israel negatively. Clearly, the Brand Israel campaign is not working. Clearly, BDS is having an impact on people. There are 3 main principles for BDS in terms of campaigning for BDS. So BDS is 2 parts: the principles, the rights, and the tactics. As far as the rights are concerned, the 3 rights, ending the occupation, ending racial discrimination, and the right of return, That's not negotiable. Those are our basic. Yeah, the first.
Ending occupation.
Ending occupation. Ending racial discrimination, so giving full equality to Palestinian citizens of Israel. And the third is the right of return for refugees in accordance with international law. That's the principles part, which is not negotiable. What is very flexible, nuanced, and negotiable, and depends on the context, is the tactics. How do we do BDS in every context? In Paraguay, it's not the same as Sweden, definitely, and definitely it's different than Germany. So in every context, activists in that context decide what best to do, whom to target, how to target. That's a very important message. So context sensitivity is the main principle in doing BDS. Context sensitivity, we call it. The second principle is gradualness. So the three practical principles: context sensitivity. The second is gradualness, that we approach BDS successes gradually. We can't jump from A to Z. We've got to build it one step at a time. So you want the supermarket to boycott all Israeli products? Well, you won't get there if you don't start with one step at a time and see what kind of alliances you can build around the specific boycott campaigns you're doing. Third is sustainability. It's not enough to win a victory too fast, because if it's too fast, you lose it very fast. So it's very important to sustain victories. If we convince a supermarket to boycott, let's say, a company dealing in settlement products, we want to maintain that success because we know the lobby and the Israeli government and the US government will do their absolute best. And in fact, they do. I mean, lest you think I'm exaggerating, when the British Academic Union first endorsed BDS motions, I mean not complete BDS, but first endorsed measures of BDS in 2007, I believe. The UCU, not the AUT, not the Association of University Teachers, but the University and College Union. The US Congress condemned the British Union for deciding to boycott Israeli universities. Imagine the US Congress issuing a statement against a trade union, an academic union in a second country because of action against a third country. So that's the level of counter BDS measures we're dealing with. We're not dealing with a bunch of lobbyists going around. No, we're dealing with the US government. We're dealing with Congress. That's what Israel mobilizes. Whenever we have a win, they mobilize Congress. The big stick of Uncle Sam is always what we see in front of us when we have any BDS successes. Now, so we're having an impact. Two examples of economic impact. Veolia is a French company involved, everyone knows Veolia, transport, water, sewage, and so on. And everyone hates Veolia because no one likes privatizing water and sewage treatment and so on. People like that water to be public, to remain public. No one wants their water to be privatized. So Veolia is very hated around the world, which makes it an easy target for us. We always find big allies. Whenever we target Veolia in any country, we always find big alliances helping us against Veolia. But we've targeted Veolia with a proper campaign since November 2008 in the first BDS conference in Europe held in Bilbao, in the Basque Country. Since November 2008 till now, a mere 5 years, Veolia lost close to $20 billion worth of contracts. Close to 20 billion, mainly due to BDS activism in Sweden, in Britain, Ireland, and elsewhere. But Britain and Sweden were the biggest success, especially the UK. Huge success for the anti-Veolia campaign. Palestine Solidarity Campaign activists all over Britain are doing an amazing job targeting Veolia. One city council after another, they're hunting them down, basically. And Veolia is losing a lot of contracts. And now they're starting to lose contracts in the US because of their involvement in the Jerusalem Light Trail, which is an illegal project connecting the illegal colonies with the city of Jerusalem, because of their involvement in the Tovlan landfill, where they handle settlement and Israeli sewage in occupied Palestinian land, in the West Bank. Just imagine. And they used to, until very recently, handle apartheid bus lines for Jewish settlers only, that Palestinians are not allowed on. Now they sold off their bus lines to an Israeli company because of pressure in the US, BDS pressure in the US. They were about to lose a bus contract in the US, and they decided to sell off all their bus lines in Israel. Another company that we're having big success against is G4S, the largest security company on earth, British-Danish security company. Many people don't know G4S until you start looking for their sign G4S. You see it everywhere. Airports, government offices, trade union office, everywhere. G4S is an octopus all over the world. The largest security company with close to 700,000 employees around the world and huge contracts. We've targeted G4S since last year, a bit over a year. And so far, I mean, we just started targeting G4S, and they already announced we're pulling out of the West Bank. We're pulling out of Israeli projects in the West Bank. G4S provides security to Israeli prisons where Palestinians are tortured, so direct violation of international law. They provide security for Israeli settlements, illegal colonies in the occupied West Bank, and they provide security systems and services to Israeli checkpoints in the occupied territories. So absolutely guilty. I mean, there's no question about G4S's complicity in violations of international law.